It's been years since we looked at AMD's first flagship graphics card, only this time we've got more time on our side, and we're taking a look to find out, is this where it all went wrong? Right, so way back in 2018 we took a look at the Radeon 2900 XT, AMD's first graphics card since the takeover of ATI, and we did have a decent look over the card and an array of benchmarks, but it's right about time we did this a bit more justice and take a look at the card not just by itself, because at the time it was an okay budget proposition, but with some up-to-date drivers, some extra benchmarks, and find out nearly 20 years on from its original release, how far has AMD come, for those of you looking to grab one, how well do they perform today, and in the context of history, is this the start of all of AMD's problems? So while we give this relatively ancient little card a bit of a clean-up, I'm going to recap the history real fast. The original video is still up, but it does have some production problems, and we've come a long way since then. I mean, I think that was mostly shot on a Nexus 6, and, you know, this card deserves a video given the history it has. Released in 2007, the card was initially delayed for months. See, this was an era where things changed for AMD. They had just bought ATI, who up until this point, they'd been doing a rather successful job keeping things under control in their end of the market. They had their legendary 9000 series, which sprung them into the mainstream, and with minor revisions going forward, they were safely doing a good job outpacing Nvidia. I mean, they'd even got themselves into the Xbox 360, which was a lot of people's first experience into the world of HD graphics, and one that I still remember fondly today. I remember being blown away by seeing the graphics on the Xbox 360, and the power behind that was from ATI. Now, this mention of the Xbox 360 is exactly where this card comes stemming from, something that we will eventually cover in its own video. However, they couldn't just release that as its own card, being the strange contraption it was, but time was ticking, and although they may have been responsible for DirectX 10 over on console, on PC there was already only one option, Nvidia's legendary 8000 series, which they'd already showcased the previous year in 2006. DirectX 10, unified shaders, new SLI support, they were making a comeback of obscene proportions, and towards the end of the year, they'd solidified this defeat with the release of the 8800 series, a name that virtually everyone here will know, and they did it. They knocked ATI, now AMD, off the top spot, with what appeared to be no hope of coming back. Benchmarks even included Half-Life 2 being shown off at 2560 by 1600, and that was in 2006. That is a huge resolution that people aren't even managing today, and they were showing that off in 2006. To make matters worse, people were expecting big things from AMD here, given they just bought out ATI. You know, they've made a killing with the Athlon 64 series, which until a couple of weeks ago I hadn't really tested, and that stuff was absolutely insane. So people were expecting big things. And the issue was, there were months and months of delays, and Nvidia wanted to rub that in a little bit by offering the new 8800 Ultra, meaning AMD wasn't just having to compete with a card from 6 months ago, they had a fresh flagship to compete against while having no card on the market, until eventually, in mid-2007, we saw it, the 2900 XT, and things, well, they didn't look good. Only slightly faster than the cheaper Nvidia budget offering, and slower than the GTX, which was the flagship from 6 months prior, there was very little going for the card. Prices were quickly slashed, and AMD was having to sell these things for, I'm guessing, a relatively hefty loss, taking the crown for price to performance because of this, but in a scene dominated by who performs best, that seemed to be a crown they wouldn't be able to shift for years. Hoping to claw by with features and pricing in mind, the card was never too awful when it came to things like media decoding, and even had advanced features like tessellation early on, which did suffer with adoption, and by the time it was adopted, performed pretty terribly on AMD cards until at least the R9 285 years and years later. There was some fun forms of anti-aliasing going on with CFAA, which offered even quicker performance because MSAA tanks performance on a card like this, but you know, it resulted in some slightly muddier looking games according to reviewers of the time. Personally, I never saw anything like that, but then again, the era this was reviewed in, every game came with a brown beige filter covering most games. So They looked pretty muddy the moment you booted them up, unfortunately. Honestly though, you could go on about this card for eons, about the strange design choices, the brute performance, everything like that. To more or less sum it up, after years and years of ATI success, it seemed a dead end had been reached, and I doubt their takeover from AMD was entirely responsible, but for your first line of graphics cards, it certainly doesn't look like the best start, and that 8000 series was seriously stiff competition. But today, in 2024, the history is behind us. And just how well does the card perform with the latest titles, the AAA classics, and then some good old retro gaming? But before we get into that though, this thing was meant to be a flagship, and despite the story, there is still quite a lot going on behind the shroud, because brute forcing power is something that started here, and doesn't seem to be something that AMD has dropped for a long time. Released in May of 2007, the Radeon 2900 XT was in many ways a complete overkill card, complete with 320 cores, 16 TMUs, 16 ROPs. It even had 1 GB of GDDR4 communicating over a massive 512-bit memory bus. But it was the start of the terascale architecture, something I have very mixed feelings about in most forms. It does support DirectX 10, has support for OpenGL4 up to a certain point, and all of this comes at a price where, brute force power, just everything about this card seems excessive. And even the power consumption is slightly excessive, with 170 watts under complete full load during my testing. Still, that's a lot of power, in both ways, for a card with such a troubled history. You can pick them up relatively cheap now, and a lot cheaper than their 8000 series equivalents, which people have now started scalping? But anyway. We're running this with a Ryzen 7 3700X, 32GB of DDR4 RAM, and that's more than enough to see the performance we can get out of this thing. I've tested the card with the latest drivers and some other drivers later on in the video to see where performance lies in the modern day, as getting drivers onto this thing, it can be a nightmare. I've never been a fan of Terascale, and it took me a while to actually get the latest drivers on here. The ones that come with the operating system, I'll speak more about them later, but realistically, your best choice is the final 13.4 beta drivers that we're using here, so the last ones released from AMD. So why don't we get around to finding out just how a card with such a notoriously troubled history performs in the benchmarks. Starting off our benchmarks, we have Black Mesa running here in high definition 720p with a mixture of medium and high settings, mostly leaning towards the higher end of settings actually here, with an average of 48 FPS. We could go over this and lower than this in certain areas, mostly outdoor areas actually, which proved to be one of the areas the card struggled with most, but generally we hovered around this figure, even in areas full of particle effects and explosions. It wasn't all sunshine and roses though. No, far from it. The game would crash constantly unless you started it and then proceeded to change it between borderless full screen and then back to exclusive full screen, and you couldn't just leave it in borderless either because otherwise it wouldn't utilize the graphics card and you'd see about 15 FPS. So not an ideal situation, but once you had it up and running, I got a bit carried away playing this. It was actually very smooth on the card. To put things in more of a perspective, Half-Life 2 ran with ultra settings in 900p with well over 100 FPS in some of the more intensive open area segments, and I like to use those for testing because, even in those smaller, more enclosed parts, we could see even higher frames than this. This was the latest version with all the fancy Source Engine updates, and for some reason though, our card was a bit funny about the Source Engine here, and something odd was going on with resolutions, as the game would only show us up to a 900p maximum, despite supporting far higher. It's very strange because we know this card can handle at least 1080p, possibly even more in this game, but still, I've always had slight issues with Terascale drivers, so 900p it'll have to be, ultra settings, well over 100 FPS, not a problem at all. Grand Theft Auto 4 is renowned for running best on this era of GPUs, given they are from when this game came out, and this port is so horrifically optimized that I swear every time they update it, the benchmarks just completely change. But anyway, you know, the issue is you run the in-game benchmark, and if you believe those figures, apparently we're getting 57 FPS. But the problem is that doesn't take into account the frame times, which were erratic no matter what driver you used or what system you put the card into, with the game regularly skipping around the place and being a horrific mess. However, once I enabled a 30 FPS cap externally, this was without a doubt one of the smoothest experiences I've had of GTA 4 that wasn't running in backwards compatibility on the Xbox One X. Just look at those frame times, they are dead smooth, and the input latency, it felt like it vanished as soon as we had that cap in place. Definitely more of an issue with the the game, rather than the card, and given how smooth we now have it, I'd consider this a good experience for GTA 4, so well done 2900 XT, and pretty bad showing GTA 4. When people think of city builders, you generally think lightweight and easy to run, but that is really not the case here in City Skylines. We had to turn the game down to its absolute lowest settings to achieve anything resembling a playable frame rate, and even then the game did struggle with larger towns and cities, but still for the most part the 2900 XT did manage what can be a rather intensive game, just as long as you weren't planning on growing anything too big. You know, if you went bigger than the initial plot of land, the 2900 XT fell apart in standard fashion here, where once things get intense, you go over a cliff edge, from sudden playability to just an awful experience, which is something that has echoed throughout a few of these benchmarks now. Skyrim, on the other hand, ran brilliantly, with the game averaging near 60 FPS in a lot of places, and often around the mid-50s when anything was going on. The game defaulted to 720p high definition with the high preset, and looked amazing while being very solid to play. I was very surprised to see that our frame rates in cities was as high as it was, given that's an area that usually is much more intensive than the world. One area the 2900 XT seems to have over its Nvidia competition is when the drivers actually support the game, and a card has a chance to use its brute force power, you can see how this card was so nearly not a blunder. It just seems like when games can understand this card, and when the card has drivers that like the game, you end up with an experience where you aren't just matching the consoles of that generation, you are absolutely destroying them here, with higher settings and nearly twice the frame rate. But it's a shame that that isn't the go-to experience on this card. Fable Anniversary wasn't too bad either. Originally defaulting to all low settings, it wasn't long before I started cranking a few of those options up. And we did run the game without the horrific FXAA it comes implemented with, as it looks more like someone smeared Vaseline over the game, and restores some rather pleasant looking areas of an otherwise dreary world. I prefer the Lost Chapters, but that's already a given. Still, when you were going around, questing, fighting, doing whatever you wanted to do, the game held up far better than I thought it would, and did really well with that 55 FPS average, even when there were lots of fancy effects going on, which shows that once again, when this card understands a game, you get a good experience. Grand Theft Auto 5 ran with its usual AMD issues, something that was prevalent on the game's release and was only ever fixed with driver updates that these cards never got. The card ran worse than even a 256MB 8800 GT from Nvidia, the lowest end version. So that really puts into perspective the choice with these kind of cards. In single player, for some reason, the card never gets fully utilised outside small bursts, leading to very erratic frame times and horrific latency, something that really shouldn't be the case here. There is no way that AMD's flagship should be doing worse than Nvidia's cut-down offering. But it's an AMD issue with drivers, and these cards are more than capable of running, I'm sure, a lot of games like this, but unfortunately, AMD threw us under the bus here, and we don't have the drivers to, come back and fix them. However, I did do some further testing later down the line with online mode, but that'll be coming up in its own section, and I think you'll find it very interesting just how well the game ran. Kerbal Space Program is not an easy game to benchmark, given that it will suffer slowdown on even the best of PCs, so trying to find settings that resembled a mix of 1, making the game look like something you'd want to play, and 2, won't actually need NAS themselves to render it, did prove a little bit of a challenge. But eventually we got there, with the game being fairly smooth, all the while you weren't blasting huge rockets off into the sky. not like that's what this game's about at all, but you know, you'd see 15 to 20 FPS, but that isn't too much of the card's fault given the game could just run like this. I know it can run slightly better on the Nvidia equivalents from this era where I've tested them, but you know, I don't want to make too many excuses for this card. It ran, it could do better, but at the same time, this is not an easy game to benchmark. So playable, but could be better. Eventually, I did get Far Cry 3 to run. Turns out I'd never logged into the new Ubisoft launcher, and my account was still tied to Uplay, and these AMD drivers caused some sort of issue that made them suspend my account. I have no clue. Anyway, they're weird issues. I'm not sure if it's Ubisoft to blame or AMD on this one for weird drivers, but anyway, rather annoying. The game ran rather well, and often the game can suffer with inconsistent frame rates, and from what I understand is not too great of an experience on the next gen consoles where they can drop all over the place. However, here on an old 2900 XT, it does manage fairly well. There were of course drops when in combat, but nothing too awful, and I consider this a very playable experience with a decent set of settings. Not exactly the height of difficulty with this one though. RimWorld ran fine in 720p with the usual default settings enabled. Given this game's Unity origins, the game is heavily CPU bound, mostly to 1 or 2 cores at the best, and especially in the late game where the majority of slowdown comes from the processor struggling. But still, the graphics card was more than happy to render the game, even if it is a top-down 2-dimensional colony builder. But still, as long as you had a good enough processor, there's no reason why you couldn't play a great game like this with a 2900 XT. Apparently one of the last games supporting DirectX 10, according to the PC Games Wiki, and a few other sources, with Black Skylands, released just last year in 2023. Now, I have never tried this game before, and initially I thought we were off to a brilliant start with some lovely looking pixel art cutscenes, but that was about it. See, I know this game is called Black Skylands, but unless they meant that title literally, all you get to see here, on this graphics card, is a black skyland with a pleasant looking HUD over the top of it, and even then, it couldn't manage much more than 30 FPS with constant frame drops. Interesting, but I'm not surprised. But can it run Crysis? Well, yes, and it did a spectacular job. Not quite 8800 GTX levels of performance, not one bit at all, but seeing the game run with high settings in 900p is always something to look at. There was no point lowering the resolution as the game generally ran about the same, if not worse, so we decided that 900p was the sweet spot. However, even across multiple sets of drivers, the game did have issues with the resolution change, sometimes completely dropping out the display until you blindly alt-tabbed your way back in when you change resolution. A recurring theme here. Even if the performance is pretty solid, the actual user experience can be quite poor, and these issues didn't persist on a normal GPU in this system. So yes, this seems to be a Terascale 1 thing. I don't know if maybe it's just me, maybe it doesn't like the system, but it didn't like resolution changes, specifically to 720p, and around that sort of mark. Higher than this it was fine, lower than this it was fine, but 720p in Crysis did weird things. But I did mention GTA Online there, and the easiest way for me to explain this and start the talk on drivers was to just tell you on the fly as I was benchmarking it and let you see for yourself exactly what I mean. Right, so you draw me back over in GTA, but this time GTA Online, and as we saw from the benchmarks before, GTA doesn't run particularly well on these older Terascale cards, but GTA Online seems to suffer less with the frame time issues. Not majorly, because these AMD drivers are notoriously rough, but the game doesn't hitch as much in GTA Online. And I've always said GTA Online does tend to be a little bit less intensive, regardless of what people think. It's only when you get over 16 players and the netcode breaks that the game runs much worse. But as you can see, we're actually seeing proper graphics card utilization here, with frame times that are much smoother and much more playable than the single player experience. And I don't know what it is, but GTA Online seems to utilize these Terascale cards just a lot better than the single player mode does. Because previously I was trying to control a plane in single player and I'm tapping a key and it's just doing nothing. But here in GTA Online, here in GTA Online, You know, we're seeing relatively decent frame times, as far as a terascale card goes, and a relatively decent experience that we just didn't get before. And I'm not too sure what it is in single player that causes that. I mean, there you go. An explosion in single player dips you down to single-digit frame rates. But here in GTA Online, I mean, it's not ideal, and the frame rate does take a little while to stabilize after it, but it does run better. It is more controllable. There isn't that weird input latency and a guaranteed spike. I mean, if we get in a car here, maybe that can demonstrate it better. But I think my main takeaway here is drivers are just such a limit on a card like this, and I'm never happy about it. I've never been happy with terascale drivers, but it's just weird things like this that you can play GTA Online absolutely fine. We're playing it here 720p with high textures and medium settings, and you know, the game looks alright, it's running alright, there's no insane latency. I just can't wrap my head round why this is a thing. Now, I know a lot of people like it when we test some emulation, and generally you're looking at PS2 and GameCube emulation here. That's the very most you'll be doing. Don't worry, all your handhelds will run just fine. But when you want to move up to more modern consoles, well, you're going to be looking at custom forks that either enable DirectX 9 or OpenGL4. Generally, OpenGL4 worked better here, which is weird for an AMD card. But once you've got them all sorted, don't worry, because we saw some great games running here with upscaling and full-speed emulation. Wind Waker here looked extremely good in a 720p resolution and didn't cause the card a moment of trouble, and it saw full utilization throughout. I did try and dabble in a slight bit of overclocking, which led to me setting a baseline test of 6553 in CloudGate, and a rather respectable score, which saw the demo run at a really fluent frame rate. Trust me when I say that I've seen these run in single digits. The only issue is that any changes to our core or memory did not go down too well on the card, with it either artifacting or crashing outright when any of these were changed, you know, to any amount that would make a degree of difference. I know that a lot of these cards were sold with a 2 8-pin connector setup, specifically for overclocking, but we don't have that here. I did try testing on a different set of drivers, and even a completely different system, but you know, we've just lost the silicon lottery here. Shame, as these things can be pushed quite far, with most people being able to max out the sliders, but for us, it's either artifacting or crashing, which is a bit of a shame. Talking about changing drivers though, I have to say that I've never been fond of AMD's terascale drivers, mostly terascale 1 being more or less abandoned by AMD at the first possible instance, with a final rushed out beta release being the last thing these cards saw. Meanwhile, Nvidia supported Tesla and the subsequent Fermi series, these cards direct competition for years, with great final drivers that were stable and even supported DirectX 12. But these cards, no, not one bit. Installing them to a modern operating system almost always requires you to manually do it via the INF file. The automatically installing ones from Windows 7 and upwards are more or less useless regardless of the operating system you use. It's now raining while I'm having this rant and something's just fallen over. But yeah, there's a huge bug there. Once they install the drivers automatically with the operating system, they show up as a generic display adapter. But they show up as a 2900 XT in the actual display manager. Ridiculous. Either way, I went back and tested 3 major releases of the latest beta drivers, the final stable release and the Catalyst 10 drivers from the card's heyday, and there was little to no difference made. In Black Mesa, we saw the older drivers were slightly smoother, but it was margin of error really, because when you're actually running the game on a wish and a prayer, well, you know, it's not great. Either way, I will say Catalyst 10 did run some things slightly better when, you know, you have the full screen option on, but even then, that was because it didn't crash. That's the only way that I mean that. Crysis ran slightly better on the older drivers, but between all 3 of them, there was no discernible difference when you're actually playing it. GTA 5 was absolutely unplayable on the final stable release of drivers, either offline or online, with the frame rate being all over the place, and the early drivers ran in tandem with the beta drivers, the beta release having a slight edge, but once again, very little difference between them. And then finally, Half-Life 2 showed that for the real classics, there is a genuine reason to hang about using the older drivers, but still, it all depends. You know, unless you're going to be running a game at 100 FPS with ultra settings, do you want to go to the hassle of finding the older drivers? Probably not. So, yeah. The rain has just stopped as I finished my rant. That was oddly poetic. That really built up the atmosphere. But terascale drivers, they're not good. I really don't like them. So I just can't wrap my head around why AMD left these drivers in such an awful way. I know they weren't happy with the 2000 series, but remember, they had 2 generations more after this based on this terascale architecture, and they were much more well received. So why is it a card that clearly from what we've seen today can handle its own nearly 20 years later was left in such a poor way? I know AMD are probably ashamed of this card, and it doesn't help the fact that they've left them this way. These cards have virtually no modded driver support, and you're stuck playing the lottery on Catalyst driver versions till you find one that works for what you want it for, and I find that appalling. I haven't ever really been a big fan of terascale, but going back to use this card made me realise its potential, until the onslaught of issues all revolving around the software made me accept that these cards were abandoned by their creator AMD with final drivers that were awful. And we used a Radeon 9700 Pro last week on ATI drivers, and the drivers were fine. I used the same drivers for Windows 2000, Windows XP, Windows Vista and Windows 7, and they were all right. But why is it AMD have managed to do this thing so bad that the 2900 XT is unusable with even its final drivers? So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that little rant. Usually I'm a big defender of AMD's drivers. Since GCN I've had good experiences, and before, with the X series and prior, they're good. But terascale, not enough people focus on that. Is where AMD's issues start. These drivers are awful and these cards are abandoned. So there we have it, the Radeon 2900 XT. And what are my thoughts? Well, I see exactly why AMD distanced themselves from it so fast, with how it became stuck in this weird middle ground of an okay price to performance flagship. But so many of these cards' problems stem from AMD themselves and the lack of support in the long run. No way should this card struggle with games that a lower-end 8800 GT from Nvidia with hardly any VRAM can manage. But for those classic titles in 2024, well, people are now scalping the 8000 series from Nvidia, but these things are still flying under the radar. So what was once a flop has turned into kind of a retro king, but just remember, they have that reputation for a reason. And AMD does not deserve to get away with offering final drivers this bad. I mean, they have got away with it because no one else is going out there to buy these cards. But imagine how good this thing would have been in the long run. Imagine that fine wine technology applying to terascale. They could have carried these things on for years. Instead, Tesla and Fermi tend to be doing better. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and thank you very much for watching. Good night.